that challenge our democracy. He has started a series of reality check videos called Extremist Beat that will examine the rise in the prominence of extremist groups and movements. In the theme of his new book, Lincoln and the Fight for Peace, Avlon describes Lincoln advocating unconditional surrender followed by magnanimous peace. Like Lincoln, Avlon proposes that for democracy to succeed requires moral courage balanced with the moderation in our politics. Previously, John was the editor-in-chief and managing director of the Daily Beast until 2018, during which time the site's traffic more than doubled to over 1 million readers a day, while winning 17 journalism awards. John is also the author of Independent Nation, Wingnuts, and Washington's Farewell. Lincoln Group, I am pleased to present our distinguished speaker, John Avlon.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you, David. And it's really a pleasure and honor to talk to you all as Lincoln heads, of DC Unite. And I got to say, those events coming up sound pretty cool. I may want to come and do the walking tour. I'll start by just sort of laying out the book, and then we can have a good conversation. It's a little different than what I'm normally doing as I get into the book tour groove, because I'm talking to a group full of experts. Everyone knows Lincoln, but you know him, you know his granularity of his character, which is to me the most inspiring thing about him. I'll begin by simply saying that, this book is about Abraham Lincoln's plan to win the peace after winning the war, his vision for national reconciliation and reunification. And one question I get a lot is why another book on Lincoln? It's not simply enough that you want to write one because he's a pleasure to spend time with. It's not just enough that he's our forever American, and there can never be enough books about Lincoln. Part of the process of history and applied history, as I love it, is useful wisdom. And Lincoln is replete with that, particularly at a time when we're again defending our democracy. But I was particularly interested in Lincoln's plan to win the peace, partly because it's something we've not done so well in recent years. And I read a quote by General Lucius Clay, and this was more than a decade ago, but sometimes the seeds of books sprout over time. And Lucius Clay was, as you all know, the American general who oversaw the occupation of Germany. He was born in Georgia, Macon, Georgia, 30 years after the end of the Civil War. His father was a 3-term Georgia senator who actually succeeded John B. Gordon in the Senate, the Confederate general. And a reporter asked him towards the end of the occupation of Germany, which is known as the Good Occupation, what guided his decisions. And Clay said, "I tried to think what Abraham Lincoln would have done for the South if he had lived." And that to me was profound and fascinating, because of course it gets to the heart of drawing on the wisdom of the present, applying it of the past, applying it to the present, so you can chart a path to a better future. And from that, I wanted to follow on my Washington's Farewell book, where he describes the forces he fears could destroy our democratic republic, with a look at another centrist leader in a time of crisis, the ultimate crisis. But before I really convinced that it was worth my time and the reader's time to do it, I called people like Harold Holzer to tell them about this idea I had, to see if it had been done before, see if I was stretching. I spoke to Daniel Weinberg. I'll never forget this conversation at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago, which I'm sure you all are familiar of. And I explained the idea, basically, Lincoln as a portrait of a peacemaker. And he looked around those 3 rooms that are massive and full of books. And he said, "I'll be darned, I don't think anybody's done that." And the reason is, of course, as I explained to folks, Lincoln's assassinated 5 days after Appomattox. He never gets to implement his vision. But as I focus on the last 6 weeks of his life, between the second inaugural and his last speech on the White House grounds, both of which are preoccupied with questions of reconciliation, reunification, and reconstruction. As I read his comments, to Grant and Sherman and Porter on the River Queen, to Grant on the steps of Petersburg, the presidential proclamation where he lays out his initial vision of reconstruction, you see that he was already in the midst of war, thinking about how to win the peace. I think Lincoln's core insight is that if you don't win the peace, you don't really win the war. And that's particularly urgent given the fact there'd never been a civil war on this scale before in human history. And so part of what's so impressive about Lincoln's achievement is that he has no one to draw on. There's no historical figure he can take off the shelf and learn from in that precise circumstance. And so his commitment to reconciliation, and I say he's a reconciler in a time of radicals and reactionaries, the fact that even in the midst of war, that he is able to look into the future and imagine a future that's not predetermined by the pain of the past and the present, which is one of the great challenges of reconciling leadership. That early on, he begins to establish a plan to imagine how the nation can heal itself out of civil war. I think particularly of the legislation that he passed in 1862, the darkest year of the war, not just the Transcontinental Railroad, but things like the Homestead Act and the land grant colleges, things that imagine economic expansion after the war. And it seems to me that part of his wisdom and his vision is that he wants to depolarize that North-South divide by moving the nation's attention west. That he's thinking practically about securing the gains, the military gains, imposing law and order, and then going through a process of political reform to remove the root causes of the war, economic expansion, so that people feel invested in a shared sense of an optimistic future for the country, and then cultural reintegration, which is the most difficult thing to do, but which he knew would take time. He knew it wasn't enough just to simply have his words, but here's where his personal example mattered so much, particularly in those last 6 weeks of his life. And there's a phrase now called conflict transformation, which actually tracks those three areas. That one of the innovators of John Paul Lederach, a peace negotiator, described Lincoln as steering towards a horizon of reconciliation. I love that phrase, a horizon of reconciliation, because it's distant, it takes time, but with the right leadership, it creates a sense of momentum towards something meaningful. And the fact that Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction combined an insistence on unconditional surrender with magnanimous peace is particularly powerful. The fact that he wanted liberal and honorable terms for the Southern rank and file, but he wasn't going to let the Confederate leadership off so easy. And that he wanted to balance that sense of amnesty with a movement towards voting rights for Black Americans. It's also evidenced in things like his establishment and signing of the Freedmen's Bureau, which Andrew Johnson disastrously undercuts. But, and I tell all the stories of City Point, things that this group is going to be more familiar with. But, the book opens with the arrival in Richmond. And actually, I'll read the opening paragraphs for you all, if that's all right. Because for me, Lincoln at the fall of Richmond is one of the most dramatic moments in American history. And I think it gets short shrift. It doesn't have the centrality that I think it deserves, given the cinematic quality of Lincoln arriving with his son, with the fire still burning. Anyway, here's the introduction of the book. Abraham Lincoln walked into the burning Confederate capital, uphill from the river, passing abandoned slave markets on his right, holding his son Tad's hand on the boy's 12th birthday. After 4 years of civil war, the President of the United States was in Richmond. Now he knew all the suffering had not been in vain. Liberty and union would defeat slavery and secession. He did not stride into the city like a conquering hero flanked by a vast army. Instead, he arrived on a longboat with a small crew, including an admiral, a bodyguard, and a dozen sailors who acted as oarsmen. There was no military escort waiting to greet them as they scraped ashore. They were strangers in a strange land, wandering past burnt-out buildings that jutted up like tombstones as smoke billowed against a blue sky. A low murmur rose among the ruins at the sight of the 6'4" man in black, slightly stooped, topped by his signature stovepipe hat. It was the sound of rumor turning to revelation. A crowd of liberated slaves gathered around Lincoln. They grabbed at his clothes and fell at his feet. "Don't kneel to me," Lincoln gently rebuked them. "That is not right. You must kneel to God only and thank him for the liberty you will afterward enjoy." Thomas Morris Chester, a pioneering Black war correspondent for the Philadelphia Press, was among the first journalists to see Lincoln enter the rebel capital, and he scribbled down the celebration. Quote, old men thanked God in a very boisterous manner, and old women shouted upon the pavement as high as they'd ever done at a religious revival, he wrote. There were many whites in the crowd, but they were lost in the great concourse of American citizens of African descent. Those who lived in the finest houses either stood motionless upon their steps or merely peeped through the window blinds. It seemed that the meek would finally inherit the earth, or at least Richmond. And I love Thomas Morris Chester as a character, by the way, and I try to build him out. He was a brilliant writer. An anthology of his writings was published in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And he is a fascinating figure. He was briefly the editor of the Star in Liberia, came back to raise a militia, didn't get permission from the Pennsylvania governor, joined the Philadelphia Press as a war correspondent, covered in particular the 25th Corps and a lot of the black troops, and later would go on to become the first Black man admitted to the bar in England, and then ultimately actually served in a militia alongside Longstreet in Louisiana. He's a fascinating figure and a brilliant writer. But the story of Lincoln in Richmond, which is the center of the book as well as the introduction, is so remarkable to me because you see his magnanimity, these moments where he's meeting with members of the Confederate cabinet like Judge Campbell and lays down his indispensable conditions. He sits in Jefferson Davis's chair. He speaks to the formerly enslaved throngs while flanked by Black Union soldiers in uniform. When he tours the city, he passes the Libby prison. And I love that the crowd shouts at him, tear it down. And he doesn't listen to the mob. He raises his hand and says, no, leave it as a monument. I love that because what Lincoln obviously understood is not only the importance of resisting a mob, but that erasing history is too easy. It absolves us. It's much more important to leave things as monuments so that we can confront our history and learn for the right lessons from it, so we're not condemned to repeat it. And then, of course, there's his wonderful advice, which ends the introduction to General Godfrey Weitzel, where he asks for his advice on how to handle the conquered Richmond folks. And he says, it seems to me that we won't extinguish our resentments through resentment and division. He says, hatred and division. If I was you, I'd let him up easy. Let him up easy. And Lincoln's leadership is always inspiring, but I think is more needed now than ever, not only because there are challenges to our democracy, but because what Lincoln reminds us, as does the contrast with Andrew Johnson, is that character is the indispensable quality in a president. And one of the things as someone who's worked in government and journalism and written history that interests me is how someone's personality ends up driving their principles and their politics and their policy. And for me, beyond all the Lincoln's combination of opposites, which allows him to transcend a lot of the dualities that divide America, it's rooted in just empathy and honesty and humor and humility. And from those qualities, I think, come his principles that are translated into politics and policy. I think John mentioned that I write about him as someone who balanced moderation with moral courage. I think that balance is so critical, and it's what's often lost. He practiced what I call the politics of the golden rule: treat others as you'd like to be treated, which is profound. He believed that the politics of decency could be the most practical form of politics, but he also understood that people were more likely to listen to reason when they were greeted from a position of strength. And, from all that comes his formulation, as I describe it, of his prescription on how you win a peace: unconditional surrender, followed by a magnanimous peace. And one of the things I focus on is what you all know is his 3 indispensable conditions for peace, which he writes down both on the River Queen during the Hampton Roads Peace Conference, and again presents to Judge Campbell in Richmond and Gustavus Myers. And the first 2 are fairly obvious, right? Resumption of the federal authority, end to slavery for all time. But the third is really fascinating because it shows again how far-sighted Lincoln is. No ceasefire before surrender. And that's so profound because, of course, that's the easy thing to do. There's all those pressures for a short piece, particularly after Lincoln's reelection. But what Lincoln, I think, understands is that a ceasefire before surrender will erode the political will to actually end slavery. And if you don't remove the root cause of the war, Lincoln understands as a new war will emerge. And I think that's the meaning of the war for him. It's not just to defend democracy at a time when all the European aristocrats and autocrats are expecting it to fail, and to squelch the idea of secession and insurrection, the idea that you can't go from the ballot to the bullet. It's not just to defend democracy. It's not just to defend liberty by ending slavery for 4 million. It's also that larger issue of winning the peace so that the next war doesn't ignite on the ashes of the past. And that really does require foresight and a very different kind of leadership, particularly than one faced with all the pressures of wartime. We're getting in a reactive cycle of revenge is the normal human thing to do. But of course, that's what makes him so extraordinary, and I fixate a lot on the second inaugural, as many have done, but I'm so struck by that switch in tone in the last paragraph from an Old Testament God to a New Testament vision. And I think that's what he lives up to. It's all there in that last paragraph, I think, in terms of his roadmap to reconciliation. Those words that you all know so well that I won't even bother to repeat them. But I think that captures the essence of him. Where the book takes the unexpected turn, which I'm confident no book on Lincoln has done, is carrying forward the afterlife of the idea, which is something I did in Washington's Farewell as well. So looking at not just how Andrew Johnson lost the peace, in effect, by being the opposite of Lincoln in terms of character: erratic, impulsive, resentful, viciously bigoted. But the way that Grant then briefly got us back on the Lincoln path. I think Chernow did a very good job with this, but it's a story that needs to be told more about how Grant went to the Capitol to insist on the passage of the 1871 Anti-KKK Enforcement Act, and the way it was, I think, in an inspired way, the way it was implemented and overseen by a Southern Attorney General, Amos T. Ackerman. But then, of course, the 1876 election, that corrupt bargain, we lose the peace definitively, or at least put reconciliation over emancipation, and slavery is replaced by segregation. But then with Wilson, on the global scale, the global side of the ledger of just and lasting peace, the way that Wilson was so influenced by being a child of the Confederacy. I say he's the only president who grew up in a state that lost a war. And you can see that experience, indeed, some of his speeches to Congress at the outset of the war, where he imagines a peace without victory, a peace among equals. But when he goes, he violates one of Lincoln's core precepts, where he agrees to a ceasefire before surrender. The German armistice occurs and they never accept defeat. There's not been a single Allied troop on their soil. The negotiations take place, punishing reparations are put in place. Wilson is ill, but he also trades a lot of his desire for a magnanimous peace to get the League of Nations, but never gets Republican buy-in. Incidentally, I'm fascinated by the fact that David Lloyd George was obsessed with Lincoln, grew up with a portrait of Lincoln over his mantle in Peace in Wales, and that George Clemenceau, as a young man, had been a reporter in the United States covering Reconstruction. So Lincoln hovers over that in ways that are perhaps less obvious in passing. But then from the profound failures to win the peace after Versailles, I think the Civil War generation applies Lincoln's ideals more faithfully and sometimes quite explicitly. Roosevelt and Churchill both explicitly endorse a policy of unconditional surrender. And I found a press conference where FDR, whose press secretary, by the way, was Stephen Early, who's a descendant of Jubal Early, it all gets very entwined, explains unconditional surrender by telling in a very roundabout Rooseveltian way the story of Appomattox, of Grant's surrender or Lee's surrender to Grant. And of course, by that time, the grandchildren of the Civil War who were coming to power then really did think about winning the peace, in part because of the failures of Versailles, but they took it very seriously. And that's where you have Lucius Clay and Douglas MacArthur, slightly different prescriptions befitting the different cultures, but drawing on the legacy of Lincoln. And indeed, Lincoln's prominence even in Japanese culture before the Second World War provided a toehold for democracy psychologically. In fact, I found that Emperor Hirohito had a bust of Abraham Lincoln in his office. during the war, which is fascinating. And then finally, the Marshall Plan, which I think is the ultimate expression. Harry Truman, the grandson of Southern sympathizers from Missouri, reflected often. I mean, his mother actually wouldn't even sleep in the Lincoln bedroom. I mean, that's how much the interfamilial resentment was handed down. But he really did apply those lessons. I found a speech where he talked about the golden rule for world peace, where he basically made the case for what would become the Marshall Plan in instinctive terms. The fact that he, having a Republican Congress, said, don't name it after me, Marshall, we're going to name it after you as Secretary of State. He's much more popular. And the fact that they get buy-in from Arthur Vandenberg at the outset. They build the Marshall Plan with the Republican Senate Foreign Relations Chairman, who, by the way, his grandfather had been a delegate for Lincoln in 1860. And they really did get the buy-in. They made it bipartisan. They agreed to a lot of his conditions. It's going to be for a predetermined amount of time. It's not going to be open-ended. It's going to be run like a business. We're going to get the Republican head of the Studebaker Corporation to come in and oversee it, who in his own memoir reflects upon the resentment that still populated the South and how we didn't take winning the peace seriously enough after the Civil War and the First World War, but we would do it then. So it's that story of the afterlife of Lincoln's idea, of his plan to win the peace after winning the war, and his vision of national reconciliation and reunification, which we never fully arrive at. But I think the lessons of Lincoln's leadership are as relevant, if not more relevant now than ever, because he does stand out from the pack, because he is so unusual that he holds himself to the highest standards in private and public. And I think that combination of moderation and moral courage does provide us a path away from violent polarization we're dealing with today. I'll leave it there for now, because I think the questions will be the most interesting part of this conversation. So let's get there.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to ask you a question, and then I'll go to Neil.
Great.
And then if anybody else has a question, you can do what Neil did, which is go down to the reactions and click on that, and you'll get a thing that says raise your hand, or throw it into the chat box, and I'll read it if you're shy. But I mean, there's so many questions, it's really hard to decide where to start. But
we can just all nerd out together. That's the fun of this.
Yeah. I mean, you basically suggest that, and in fact, I think you really just said that after World War II, our reaction after World War II, as opposed to World War I, was really what we should have done after the Civil War, that kind of fell apart because Lincoln wasn't there. I guess, do you think that if Lincoln was there, would he have been able to do that? I mean, I know that Johnson and the radical Republicans in Congress, they butted heads, and in doing so, probably pushed themselves even further out into their wing positions. Would Lincoln have been able to work through that and do some of the things that were done after the Second World War in order to make Reconstruction work better?
Well, it's a great and important question, and one that we can talk about in greater granularity because you all have such a deep knowledge. I do think it would have been different in fundamental ways, and I'll explain why, with the caveat that the what ifs of history are fun conversations in a group like this, but they're always of limited utility, right? I think there's no question that the assassination of Lincoln is the great tragedy in American history. There are plenty of others, but in terms of the trajectory implications, I was struck by the fact that in his wallet, in his notes section, he had a number of newspaper clippings, and one of which was an editorial from a Philadelphia newspaper that said, after a term of war, he's entitled to a term of peace. And I think fundamentally he is a man of peace in a time of war, and he was actually best suited to Reconstruction. Now, the radical Republicans didn't see it that way. Benjamin Wade even, mentioned strayly that, he hoped he'd be assassinated so Johnson would do the Reconstruction, because they thought Johnson would be more vindictive. They didn't think that Lincoln would be tough enough on the South. I think no question, as you say, that the pendulum swing between Johnson's own erratic nature and his resistance to anything resembling moving towards equality, his acquiescence to any application for amnesty, his own personal resentments that drove so much of his politics, and then the reaction to that from the radical Republicans set off everything in a very herky-jerky motion that Lincoln, by his very nature, could have stilled. He was steeling himself for some major disagreements with radical Republicans. I think an interesting question is, what would he have done, given the fact that for all the criticism of Lincoln as sort of a tyrant of centralized government, the mere fact that Lincoln, his vision of Reconstruction as articulated in particular in his last speech on the White House lawn is a very Federalist vision, right? He understands that this is going to be a laboratory of democracy process. He is going to be characteristically inflexible on the great goals, but highly flexible on all the details. So as long as you accept the end of slavery and rejoin the Union, of which, by the way, ratification of the 13th Amendment is going to be necessary. I mean, you know, we can get into debates about the 10% plan, but I think it's clear Lincoln was just trying to lower the bar to ease acceptance. And that over time it would grow, but it would be different in each state. He expected that. I personally think one of the reasons that the speech fixates on Louisiana is that, you know, that's where he's been preoccupied in the fact that the radical Republicans and the Democrats team up to not seat the Louisiana delegation as an irritation. I think part of the speech Louis Mazer has, I think, convincingly suggested was written beforehand, probably in mid-February, but that, you know, I think also was probably influenced by the fact he visited as a young man and saw Creole culture and assumed that at least New Orleans had some experience culturally with multiracial society. So it was going to be different. The question is, when, for example, in the fall of 1865, when a Confederate brigadier general is acting as governor, or effectively as governor of Mississippi, and institutes the Black Code, saying like, look, slavery's over, but that doesn't mean we need to accept equality. You know, Johnson acquiesced to all that. What would Lincoln have done? I think Lincoln, the lawyer, would have insisted on enforcement of the gains that had just been made. Now, where that line is, it's impossible to say. But I don't think he would have acquiesced as the way that Johnson did, because Johnson was, you know, bolstered by his own bigotry in that front. And I don't think, I know, one knows from his previous statements that he wouldn't have allowed the planter class to regain power in that same way. Not as fast. So I think it's a very different thing. That herky-jerky pendulum swing, the essential erratic nature, the undermining of the 13th and ultimately 14th and 15th Amendments, I don't think would have been allowed, even though, and I don't think he also would have allowed, you know, he wouldn't have pulled Black troops from the South like Johnson did, but I don't think he would have reimposed troops on the South the way it did. There was a window. I think what's one of the crucial lessons, there was a window within which changes could have been accepted, and that window was lost, tragically.
Neil, did you still have a question?
Come on, Neil.
You're on mute.
I did not have my hand up, but I will ask a question. I've often wondered if Hannibal Hamlin had been vice president of the second term, how radically different it could have been. I don't know, and that's my question.
That's a great question. I'm not capable of answering that because I focus on the last. I mean, I very much buy into the idea that Lincoln's decision to replace, Lincoln, Hamlin with Johnson was not done without Lincoln's knowledge. It makes perfect sense given the positioning of the National Union Party. The division wasn't east-west at that time. It was north-south. And Johnson has all the optics of someone who can reunite the nation and be part of a National Union ticket. You know, Hamlin was so absent from Washington during the war, given that the vice presidency was so different. I don't know enough about Hamlin, frankly, because I focus on 64, that election, how he would have been different. It certainly would have been different. He wouldn't have had the same baggage and resentments that I think really do drive Johnson's decision-making to a disturbing extent. But, you know, I'm sure they're smart on that question. There are probably some Hannibal Hamlin scholars on the call who can answer better than that.
Let me ask this question in the chat from Roberta Schwarzenegger, who is a longtime member who is out in Iowa now.
Oh,
So she's asking, like, why is it so often said that the North won the war, but lost the peace?
Well, I think, I mean, self-evidently. I mean, you know, the South was able to claw its way. Okay, let's slow down here, right? So one of the points that Grant makes, actually, I actually cut this from a later draft because I was going down a rabbit hole about the mechanisms for the South regaining power, and I'm trying to do things so they move quickly. But he pointed out that one of the terrible ironies of what occurred was the South was able to increase its congressional apportionment, its representation, due to black citizens being recognized as citizens, not 3/5. But then they immediately set about disenfranchising those voters. So in effect, you know, they rigged the system, resisted multiracial and majoritarian democracy, but they had an increased power in their congressional delegation and representation. I also think that for a lot of folks, and this is how I sort of understand the Confederate monuments debate, at least the ones that aren't done after Brown v. Board, is that, you know, the nation, I think a lot of the enthusiasm for Reconstruction as it applied to equality and emancipation clearly drains out after the 1873 economic crisis. But also, I think it's pretty profound, and Wilson is a perfect example of this. Reconciliation is given precedence over emancipation and its legacy and responsibility. The nation basically prioritized reconciliation between the North and South. And that power in the South politically, particularly in Congress, was solidified in a way that you didn't have cultural reintegration, and you had disproportionate power from that particular region. So, I mean, one of the stats that really stunned me was that there were 180,000 Black voters registered in 1900 in Alabama. And 3 years later, after a state constitutional amendment process, there were 3,000. I mean, that's just stunning me.
John, to that point, the aim of the Civil War was to restore the Union until about midway through, when the idea of ending slavery also became part of that goal. At no time until the very end did Lincoln describe an aim of equality, integration of these newly freed people into American society. So when he was in the second inaugural was speaking of malice toward none, charity for all, it seems like 80 to 90% of white Americans were not thinking Black people when he was saying that. And so the challenge to him was to expand this vision. And if anybody could do it, Lincoln could. But he died before it even made an issue with most Americans. This is the type of thing that we're leaping over, putting ourselves back in 1865, that I think is also going to cause problems for the current Civil War we're trying to end. How do we agree on what the objective is to be able to establish, as you said, that horizon that we're going to sail toward? Right now, there is no agreement on that horizon. There was no agreement in 1865. Lincoln may have made the point, but he didn't live to do it.
Well, I'd make the point, first of all. I mean, you know, the ultimate place we arrive at is also rooted in Lincoln's phrase, the theory of our government is universal freedom. Mm-hmm. Right? There's no contradiction inherent between equality and liberty under the practical balance of the Union. And, you know, I do think that if you look at Lincoln's letters, and particularly the speech he has read in his behalf back in Springfield, you know, I believe his backing of Black soldiers in the war, I think, was a pivotal shift for him, for many of Union soldiers, in terms of proving their mettle and pushing back bigotry based on their performance in the battlefield. They were fighting for their freedom in the Union. And I think if you trace a lot of Lincoln's letters and speeches, it's clear he's moving in that direction. They make a fine point about about, how much, that vision had been sold to the vast majority of the American people. But by the end of the war, I'm struck by the fact that the end of slavery is virtually unremarkable. It doesn't need to be written down at Appomattox. It doesn't need to be even spoken when Lincoln speaks to Campbell. It's assumed, right? The Emancipation, it's not just the passage of the 13th Amendment. The Emancipation Proclamation was controversial when he announced it, but I also know that, in the note compartment of his wallet, he has two letters ostensibly from Confederate defectors that were published in newspapers, including one in the Toledo Blade. And one of those letters talks about how Lincoln's emancipation strategy had been a success, despite the fact it was scoffed at. It helped turn the tide of the war. And Lincoln, of course, had all sorts of ironic comments about the Confederacy's belated attempt to have slaves fight on their behalf in exchange for their freedom, which is just as absurd as it sounds. So I do think it was a process of becoming an evolution on Lincoln's part and on part of the nation, but I don't think he hit it. I think by the end of the war, it was assumed. Now, the degree to which, it's always a question of degree and speed. Emancipation had been accepted, but the contemporary criticism or commentary on his last speech does concern. Some people think that, he's not moving far enough or fast enough on Black voting rights. Other people, of course, are infuriated he's moving there at all. But it's a process of becoming. And I think in Lincoln's letter to Highland as well, it's clear that that's the direction he wants to move in. He wants to parallel amnesty for the Confederate rank and file with a move towards voting rights, beginning with, veterans and, as he terms it, the very intelligent, which is a highly ambiguous phrase, of course.
If anybody has a question, just raise your hand or throw something in the comments. And Carol, I'll get to yours in a minute. I kind of want to leave that for last, but
curious what Carol's comment is there.
Yeah. You mentioned near the end of the book, you talk about MacArthur and Truman and FDR and Sun Yat-sen. And
Yeah.
I was in Cuba not long ago, and Castro, all of these people all over the world with very different political views and socioeconomic and theories, all somehow relate to Lincoln.
Yeah.
And as a Lincoln group, we're always faced with the ideas like, well, Lincoln died a long time ago. Is he even relevant anymore? But as you know, there isn't a politician who could talk for more than a minute without somehow quoting Lincoln or mentioning Lincoln, both sides of the aisle, foreign countries, everything. What is it, do you think, about Lincoln that everybody can somehow find something that they think represents their views?
Yeah, I write about this at different places in the book. I think he's the forever American. I think he combines opposites. I think that's what creates his power. Mark Twain has a great essay on Lincoln that I ultimately cut from the book, but where it talks about the importance of the fact that only someone who was born in the South and moved north it couldn't have been a Boston Brahmin who presided over the Civil War. I also think the arc of Lincoln's life happens, Trace, and I say this fairly explicitly in one paragraph, the classic hero's journey. It really does. He's the boy born in obscurity who feels a calling to something greater than himself, faces enormous odds and ridicule, and goes through a fiery trial to lead his nation, to safely to the other side, and then dies at the arc of at the height of his career. I think he's also on a subliminal level the Jesus of American politics, and not just that he died on Good Friday. I think he exemplifies the idea of meeting, loving your enemies, meeting hate with love. And I'm particularly interested in the Global Lincoln is a great book, by the way, and I drew on it, and it's fascinating to see Lincoln's influence in various cultures, and particularly in Japan and Germany and England. You can see that, particularly in England around the First World War. But I'm interested in particular on the number of Nobel Peace Prize winners who nod to Lincoln. It's an extraordinary list. And Gandhi, who didn't win a Nobel Peace Prize, but should have, admired him greatly. And again, it's this idea of a reconciling leader. Willy Brandt was obsessed with Lincoln, and the German Chancellor, Mayor of West Berlin, Nobel Peace Prize winner. Dr. King, Martin Luther King quoted Lincoln all the time. in speeches and sermons and letters all the time. It's not just the I Have a Dream speech. It's all over his repertoire. And then even Nelson Mandela, when he died, his biographer called him Africa's Lincoln. And it was because of reconciliation. That's the thing. We know, won the Civil War and freed the slaves, but it was the gesture of reaching out, that reconciling impulse after the war, that he didn't do the easy thing that politicians do all over the world, which is divide to conquer, do the us against them game. He did not do that. And that's why I think he's so inspirational.
Carol, do you want to ask the question you put in the?
Carol, I'm fascinated.
All right, well, I take it you've already read it. And I'm not sure I put this terribly well. And it is a little bit far from Lincoln's era, but the way you brought up this issue of winning the peace and thinking ahead about that made me think of the op-ed piece that was in the New York Times at the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine that asserted that the West was not completely blameless in this, in that when the USSR broke up, they lost an opportunity to do something like a Marshall Plan to help economically and in other ways. And I think that's enough. Yeah, you can talk about that.
No, I don't have the advantage of having read that specific op-ed, but I know the argument.
Yeah, I was trying to bring it up and I can't find it.
No,
now,
it's fine. Look, I am not sympathetic to the argument that NATO expansion created this crisis, right? So there's nothing that has happened in the last several years other than his successful annexation of Crimea and the lack of resolve in response to that that would justify a panic over Ukraine right now. This is simply on his to-do list, and he felt that the time was, if not now, when. But I do think there's a case to be made that clearly in Russia's transition to democracy, more could have been done by the United States and the West to help stabilize the country and not turn it over to a bunch of oligarchs who made a mockery of democracy and cause it to revert to its traditional sort of czarist path. I think that's a fine point to make, but I don't think it creates a sense that we are blameless for the situation. I think it reinforces the need to invest in peace. When you win, I mean, the George H.W. Bush did a great job of not being triumphalist at the end of the Cold War. In fact, to such an extent that he was criticized for it. People said, where's the great, we won, but he wanted to help Gorbachev save face. And I think it was from that instinct, as well as the essential modesty of the man, which is a quality they have in common. But I do think, the peace dividend that sometimes people want to spend at home, understandably, the fact that the Marshall Plan was sold successfully and foregoing a peace dividend to stabilize the peace and push back Soviet expansionism. I think the right kind of mechanisms from the international community at that time could have eased the transition and might have blunted Putin's evolution, so to speak. But I will also say, just briefly, what we're seeing today, I mean, we're dealing with two things right now. One is that I think we all realize, or should realize, that we can't take our democracy for granted. The second thing is, I think you can't take the liberal democracy, the liberal international order that America and its allies put in place after the Second World War for granted either. And I think some people did. I think some people took peace for granted, despite the fact that, the last 75 years are an anomaly, a success in the history of Europe.
I'd like to add one more thing that's a completely different topic, but since I've unmuted, and if you don't mind, you made the comment comparing Lincoln in some ways as the Jesus of American history.
Politics, yeah.
Okay, American politics, that works for me. The comment I wanted to make is that I've been very struck by the story of what happened when Lincoln went into Richmond. The parallels between that experience and the story of Jesus entering Jerusalem on Palm Sunday.
Well,
the most important part, hang on just a second. The most important part is how it could be that nobody noticed, except the people who were the least visible to the powers that be, in both cases.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful parallel. I mean, the parallelisms are all over the place. If you when you get the book, you'll see. I actually took a print from Harper's Weekly that used Appomattox and Christ entering Jerusalem as a parallel image on side by side, and reprinted a Harper's Weekly editorial where they talked about Palm Sunday being dedicated to union. I do think that, you know, there's theology all over the second inaugural, obviously, but you know, the number of people in the wake of Lincoln's death who remarked upon not just the symmetry of Good Friday, but that, you know, that his martyrdom helps cement the Union. That and it just that core impulse, I think, to meet hate with love. Is what Lincoln did. So I think he raised his game and reminded us that kindness is consistent with effective leadership. But I think there's a whole element of Lincoln's place in the firmament of America's civic religion that is fascinating to me. And I write about it a good bit, including the number of stained glass windows he is placed in.
There's a whole book of sermons preached on Easter Sunday after Lincoln's death.
I cite some of them.
Yeah.
As well as the one in the in a synagogue, Rabbi blanking on his name right now, but
Yes, right. There were lots of Jewish
Yeah.
responses too. Yeah, it's very interesting stuff, I think. So
It's
thanks
fascinating.
for indulging me.
No, fun.
John, the one you mentioned fairly early in the book that Lincoln, you didn't really call him a moderate. You said he's moderate really only in tactics. You know, he himself said that he was, you know, he was just against slavery as much as any abolitionist, but then he took different tact to eliminating slavery or trying to deal with it. Do you think, is there a lesson there for today, how we can learn how to maybe stop screaming from the outside and get in the middle and try to figure out how to resolve some of the issues?
100%. And I do call him a soulful centrist. And I do say he balanced moderation with moral courage, and he was temperamentally moderate. I also say he's content to use tactical means to achieve transformational ends. You know, he's not above the rough and tumble of politics. What's so impressive to me, and I think it's captured that debate among abolitionists so well by that famous quote from Frederick Douglass, where, you know, from a genuine abolitionist point of view, he seemed tardy, cool, and indifferent. But from the perspective of an American politician who's bound to consult, you know, his constituents on the issue of abolition, he is zealous, determined, and radical. That's the balance. You know, Lincoln was thinking bigger, certainly, than any particular interest, but he knew where he wanted to go. And that's where I think he offers us a real guidance, because he's a gradualist in many respects. I mean, think about how he handles the border states. He comes under enormous fire for that. But he knew that if he moved too far, too fast, he could have pushed them to the Confederacy, and that would be the end. And I think that's key. His gradualism has a grandeur to it because he is focused on how to achieve sustainable change. And that's what he is able to do. If he had moved faster on the issue of slavery, the whole thing could have fallen apart. And indeed, there's a wonderful editorial that's in his wallet the night he dies from Missouri, about when Missouri finally ends slavery legislatively, and praises Lincoln's path and talks about the criticism he faced. So I do think that style of governance, you know, using humor and logic and scripture to depolarize debates, empathizing with your opponents as a means of reasoning with them, having a reputation for honesty to build trust, and then being focused on the great goals, but willing to negotiate over all the details as a means to get to those goals. All those things, I think, are enormously important and relevant to the kind of leadership we need today. I think they could depolarize the country. And he also thought structurally about politics and reform in a deep way. I'll leave just, you know, on this. You know, I've got to go, but I've had so much fun talking to you, and I would love to do it again in person. Maybe I'll crash one of your in-person meetings. You know, there's that, for me, the key quote, because it's all about applies to history, is that somewhat obscure quote. It's been printed more in recent years, from after the 1864 election, where he says, "Human nature will not change. In any future great national trial, compared with the men of this, we shall have as weak and as strong, as silly and as wise, as bad and as good. Let us therefore study the incidents of this as philosophy to learn wisdom from, and none of them as wrongs to be revenged. I love that. I love that he's thinking about what lessons we can draw from current events, seeing it with the eyes of history. He's talking about applied history in a really profound way. And it is about a philosophy to learn wisdom from, and not, cultivating resentments and revenge. That to me is the whole book.
Right. Well, thank you for taking the time, and I like the idea of having you come down and talk with us in person, and maybe you can drag Harold down with you and you can have a
I
nice
will drag
little
Harold.
debate, Well, he can drag you down, whichever. But I guess, John O'Brien, did you have anything further you wanted to add?
Just appreciation for John's presentation and your book, John. It's amazing work, and thank you very much.
Thank
Yes,
you
and
very much. It's the world from you guys.
I want to thank you too, and I do highly recommend this book. It just came out just a few weeks ago.
Yep.
So I have one of the first copies off the press. So, and
There you
someday
go.
I'll get you to sign it for me.
I would be honored and delighted for all of you.
Okay, and then we look forward to having a chance to seeing you in person someday. So
Let's
thank you
do it.
very much.
Thank you.
Hey,
Take care.
hey, John,
Yes.
this is Caroline Van Dusen. We spoke in like 2013, a long time ago,
Okay.
about the Washington's farewell address.
Ah,
And I'd like to send you something that, a archival print of the Greeley letter.
oh, I would love that.
Yes, yes, yes. I
Thank
couldn't get you the farewell address. That kind of fell through our hands. But you did a great job of writing about that.
Well,
So-
thank you. I would love that. Harold,
Yes.
I think David John has my contact
Yes,
information.
actually, we've emailed and I'll forward up with
Fire
it.
it off.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yep.
Take care,
Thank you,
guys.
John.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Okay, I will.
Sorry, I missed it.